Good morning. Thanks. Hi, welcome. My name is Noah Horowitz. I'm Director Americas for Art Basel. Welcome to this beautiful new venue here. I think we started things a little bit later this morning. That's for a good reason. It's because most of you aren't yet familiar with how to walk around this building, but it's a wonderful new facility for us. Building's now complete. It's been a long time. It's been under renovation, as I'm sure many of you have recalled and remembered, for the last 3 years. It's a beautiful new facility. We're delighted to be here with all of you this morning to kick off the conversation series with Allora and Calzadilla. Some of the great artists of our time. We've tried hard over the last number of years to get him here. So thanks to both of you for coming. Manuel Cirauqui from the Guggenheim Bilbao will lead this conversation. We have 18 conversations this year. All taking place here. I really hope that you can come not only to this, but to others. They're all recorded online, so you can watch anything that you don't see. For those of you joining us that aren't here, welcome. The show this year is amazing. Inside the halls, we opened yesterday to our VIPs. We opened this afternoon to the world from 3 o'clock. There's 268 galleries this year from 35 different countries. 29 have never shown with us before. So it's an extraordinary fair. In the building that we're in, there's an entirely new space on the north called the Grand Ballroom. We've commissioned a project in collaboration with the kitchen of Abraham Cruz Vieques. It's a performance piece. It happens twice daily at 3 and 5 o'clock, so I hope you guys can join that as well in the coming days. But without further ado, I'll hand over, but thanks so much for coming. I know it's not easy, and thanks also for coming all the way from Spain. He's not been here for 12 years, so it's really great. Welcome, have a wonderful fair. Last but not least, a huge thanks. Mari, come up here for a moment. Mari Spirito has been our curator of the Conversations program for 5 years. She's an amazing colleague, and this is her last show with us in Miami, and I'd like to just send a huge thanks to her. She's an extraordinary colleague, one of the smartest people around, and this all happens because of her. So have a great day. Thanks again for coming, and enjoy your time.
Thank you, Noah. Well, thank you, Noah, and thank you, Mary, for this invitation. Thank you, Mark, and Annalie for bringing me here. It's such a pleasure to be back in Miami after these years, and to be back with Jennifer and Guillermo, artists that I've admired for a long time, and I've looked at your work since I started thinking about contemporary art and following things seriously. So it is such an honor, and I think it's just good to just get to it and talk about the things we've been ruminating lately. I will just say a few words about your practice that I've written, which is boring, but then everything we'll try to do as lively as possible. And of course, there will be time for all of you to participate in the conversation. I really hope that we'll open up topics that will excite and will inspire all of you to make comments and suggestions. So Jennifer, Allora and Guillermo Calzadilla, you have defined your practice at the crossroads of post-colonial and eco-critical perspectives. Emerging from this context and from your observation of the territory as well as the speculative research, always open-ended and inspiring, that informs your observation. We also find an interesting connecting geopolitical and archaeological material. And that's for like at least the last 10 years of your work, very, very clearly. And so in the following 45 minutes, I'd like to address some of the questions that illuminate this intersection, these two axes of your practice. And in the meantime, we are working together on a project in Bilbao. Starting next March, we will present several video works of Allora and Calzadilla as part of the Film and Video Exhibitions program at the Guggenheim Bilbao, which I've been running for the last 2 years. And so again, such a pleasure and honor. So that project also is kind of like, well, an indicator of a wider conversation, and I really see this moment between us as something that pertains in a larger and more developed talk. And I like to see it as a moment of reflection for that longer conversation. So let's just start with the first slide, and with the title of the show. I think could be a good first cue for the conversation. The title of the show we're working on in Bilbao, The Tropical Pharmacy, that you brought into the title of an artwork that is a longer title, and it's a work that is in the show. And I would like you to give us a few thoughts about this notion of the tropical pharmacy, because I know that it is not only part of one artwork; it's actually kind of like present in many of your works.
Right. So there's a text by an author named Jose Quiroga that is it's titled "Narrating the Tropical Pharmacy." And in this short essay, he talks about the Caribbean nationalist project in the 20th century that has been written under the concept of a medical construction, right? So he talks about how anti-colonial writers negotiate the relationship between nationalism and colonialism through metaphors of disease. So that text, no doubt, was an inspiration or a point of departure to thinking about this project this film that we did, but also the pharmaceutical industry history on the island as well, right? So you have, since the 1960s, you have as a model of economic development that basically functions through is foreign investment through tax exemption, right? That's the way that it works. So in this case, debt, and this is not Jose Quiroga, this is more Mauricio Lazzarato, functions as a mechanism of capture, predation, and extraction. There's a moment in which there were over 80 pharmaceuticals throughout the island, and interestingly, or factually, there was a moment in which almost all the medicine, like 85% of all the medicine consumed in the US was produced on the island. So this project that it's titled, we end up titling The Bell, The Digger, and the Tropical Pharmacy, was an artistic response to the crisis of debt, profit flight, right, and extraction. And it consisted of having the mechanism that is normally used to demolish buildings, which is, what is that big? No, not the digger, the ball, the big, the wrecking ball, thank you. So to have the wrecking ball be replaced by something that marks time, right? So the idea of a bell, like a bell tower in the city, and how a bell marks time, and how there's a sense of collective knowledge that when the bell is hit once, it represents a marking of time, or it represents a specific time, right? And then as it hits it 10 times or 15 times, it sort of presents marking of time collectively in different ways. So in this case, the bell itself, as it hits the different surfaces of the building, it's marking a different time, right? Time compresses, time expands, time becomes borrowed, time goes beyond the time of the day, right? The sleeping time, the working time. And also another element to the bell itself, it's that this object is something that is built with the harmonics in mind, right? Like the specific shape, the form, the weight. And in this particular case, there's something that happens that is what we find interesting is the relationship between harmony and disharmony in the marking of a significant time of place of work. Maybe Jennifer, I'll let you continue.
I mean, I just maybe add a couple factual pieces of information about the piece and about the historical context that Guillermo was beginning to describe. So basically in 2006, there was an internal revenue law that was phased out by the US government. The US Congress was trying to bring capital back to the mainland United States, and so they enacted a law that got rid of this Section 936, which was this particular tax law that allowed for pharmaceuticals and other manufacturing facilities prior to that to be able to be completely tax exempt. And what that meant specifically in the case of this particular pharmaceutical was GlaxoSmithKline. And so just some information, so GlaxoSmithKline produced $5.5 billion worth of products from this manufacturing plant in Puerto Rico, of which all of it was tax exempt. And it produced drugs like Avandia, which was a diabetes drug, Paxil, the heart drug Coreg, the acid reflux drug Tagament, among others. And when this tax law was expired, the company just left overnight and moved somewhere else. And so this plant, with also the facilities and infrastructure, was just left overnight, as were many others. And the economy went into a recession in Puerto Rico from that date forward. So that was the beginning of the long recession that Puerto Rico has experienced, which brings, to its most dramatic in the years prior to the hurricanes, like 2015, 2016, when the country started defaulting on its debts because it was no longer able to pay its municipal debts. And this whole complicated economic situation, gets manifested in physical places like these buildings, which this is one of them that were being shut down.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you bring that fact to the fore, because it is true that events happening recently can be read backwards and take us to the 90s, to key moments that were like, inaudible or invisible, and then you can read them even like farther back and get to the 60s, to the 50s, and to like major operations like Bootstrap, which was a key event developing multiple stages for like the creation of communities of Puerto Ricans in mainland United States, but also for this type of implantation of industries with many advantages in the island. And that type of economy in the island was co-determined by the new economy in mainland, or like all these like low wages that were crafted for Puerto Ricans to, like in Chicago, New York, etc., etc. So I think it is interesting because there's this geopolitical reading that accompanies also a reading in our history, and the way you have taken references from like minimalism or performance language or music history, and you have woven all that material together. But I really like also the fact that you have not isolated the economical factors or social factors, but you have also woven them into something that you have developed conceptually, with people, interlocutors like Yates McKee, as climate debt, and or TJ Demos. I mean, the fact that we are not talking about a debt that manifests as, as a banking phenomenon, but also, like the hurricane itself or results from climate change can produce catastrophes that are themselves bearers of a certain inequality, right? So I would like you to speak about climate debt and the way this concept in the past few years has informed your research, your work.
Well, I mean, the concept of climate debt refutes the idea that the current climate crisis is a phenomenon for which all humanity in general is equally responsible, and instead focuses on the historical debt that the global north has to the south, right? So that would be like the definition of what climate debt is. But I think that one of the ways that we starting to understand an idea of landscape in an expanded sense was with the work that we did in Vieques in the late 90s. And in there we we discover or learn about the concept of environmental justice or ecological justice that is related to a certain degree to climate debt. And specifically through the fishermen movement, that they consider themselves a species in danger of extinction, right? So extinction is not something only that happens to like, flora and fauna, but also humans themselves can be considered in a species that is in danger of extinction. In their case, because they're, in order to sustain their lives, like fishing or agriculture was prohibited or was neglected or was made not possible. So they themselves thought of them in this particular way.
I just want to step back a second and just maybe point out that I think for us, our insistence and our returning always to the site from which we live and work, which happens to be Puerto Rico, and nevertheless being participants in a global community of artists and participating in exhibitions and showing work outside, is specifically to indicate or to demonstrate how these very seemingly local issues are themselves really the manifestation of a very complex, international, globalized network of relations, of laws, finance, power, migrations, many different factors converge in a specific place, like Puerto Rico or like Vieques, even more specifically. But for us, that's why we've always been attracted to the specificity of a particular place. So, when the film we just showed of the bell, yes, it was in Sidra, Puerto Rico, but it's an intersection of forces that are absolutely, couldn't go further away, both metaphorically and physically. The owners of the profit that gets extracted off the island, where they're based, why they're there, to the issuers of the bonds and the bond debt that the government needs to run the government on, and the bond holders are also all over the world. So I just think it's important to emphasize that in our practice, our interest in being very specific and looking at specific places is not to marginalize or to say that this is something that happens here and we want to just show it to you where we are now, but rather to really point to this fact, which I think is something that we're all aware of, but it's important to reiterate this notion of this entanglement that is what the world is, and I think that that's an emphasis that I wanted to point out. And so Guillermo is now talking about the work that we did in the island of Vieques, which this slide here is showing. So this is an island that is off of the mainland of Puerto Rico, between the mainland of Puerto Rico and then the U.S. Virgin Islands and then the British Virgin Islands beyond that. That was since the 1940s, after the Second World War. It was the premier training grounds for the Atlantic Fleet Weapons Training Facility, which is it's part of the Navy, and it was also used and rented by NATO forces. So it was really like the main place to practice all types of military exercises from land, air, and sea. So this is an interesting graphic which just sort of shows the black mass on the bottom of the slide is the eastern coast of Puerto Rico, specifically the naval base that was called Roosevelt Roads, and then you see in the north, above the island of Vieques, and you can see this sort of representation of that part of the eastern part of Puerto Rico as visualized through the imaginary of the military point of view, right? Like what it looks like as a weapons training facility. And that's something that, the bombs actually fell there, and there was a population of 10,000 people who were fishermen, among others, who had to deal with this on a daily basis. But it's also entangled in everything from the Bay of Pigs, where they use specifically the shores which are in the bombing range to practice for that invasion.
To the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that were also rehearsed and practiced there.
So there's just this, the war, Korea, Vietnam. I mean, every single really operation of the military had been involved in since the Second World War was trained for at some point or another in Vieques.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that you, among many brilliant things that occur in your work, but one of the things that actually makes your work most interesting is that you have been able to read the geopolitical but also the archaeological history of the Caribbean as a prism for like a bunch of events that were actually of global importance. So this could be one of them, and the way war are rehearsed in the Caribbean, or maladies, epidemics are rehearsed in the Caribbean with all this research. Like I always remember conversations with Yasmin Raymond, with whom we've all worked about the birth control pill, and like all the experiments that were done in, yeah, exactly, sterilization, mass sterilization. No? So there is a huge level of pertinence in these events. They're not just local. You're not identifying things that matter to your people or to your neighbors. They have actually a global impact, right? So I think that that's very important, because we're trying to, like, look at this aspect not as local, but as, like something that basically you read one event into another. You use events as prisms that bring you to a, like more complex understanding of art history, for instance, or, like American history.
I know, I just wanted to point out too, of course, that that's because we have to remember that the Caribbean was, the first site of colonialism. It's where all of the, the empire went. And so it first experimented with plantation economies, with slavery, with all of these different mechanisms for creating wealth, were first started from the time of the first colonization of the Caribbean. So this notion of, this expanded, pre-globalized sort of worldview begins in a certain way in the colonization of the Caribbean. And that's such a fascinating, for me, vantage point to understand the contemporary reality, is to be reminded of its roots in the colonial project. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I like to look at the Vieques project, which generated many artworks, as a main event in your work, and then Puerto Rican Light, which also has generated, several artworks, as the next main event, and the evolution between them, bearing a lot of commonalities. So Vieques, just to give some context, there were like two main videos from Vieques, three, but wait, under discussion, returning a sound. Hey, there you go. Exactly, half mast, full mast. And but then there was landmark.
Footprints.
Exactly, the footprints piece, where you would see in all of them the involvement of the population. There was a civil disobedience, even though the events in Vieques had been happening since the 40s. In the early 2000s, there was a civil disobedience movement that was very strong, that was not finding the right channels. And Allora and Calzadilla collaborated with many of these people as agents in the artworks to mark, precisely using the metaphor of the bell. There was a relationship between sound and performance and marking time, and trying to make these signs of inscription, of historical inscription. So this is under discussion at a moment that was previous to the declaration of ending of the military.
It was after. So this is what was interesting for us. Like this film we made, it was after the military had left. So the pictures that I sort of quickly scrolled through of the footsteps had to do with the moment when there was a civil disobedience movement that had formed on the island that we were involved with.
But there are no more bombings.
And by going into the bombing range, it was a way for people to literally stop the military from dropping any more bombs there. And it eventually became took up enough force that it effectively did have, the result of the military leaving, and that was in 2003. And then after that, we had made a series of films and projects that related to what amounted to be an even more complex project in the aftermath, which is, okay, now that the military is gone and there's this sort of common enemy is no longer there, how do you deal with the project of sustainably developing the island, and for whom will benefit from that? So this film particularly talks about that question of who gets to be invited to the discussion table to talk about how does this land become developed, and to whom will benefit from that type of developmental project.
Yeah, but in any case, many people know Vieques as a vacationing place, a natural reservation. This history you're actually revealing, and in collaboration with the inhabitants, you're revealing a complexity, because there were they were not one ideology, one group, one community, one movement. They were like many people, right, intervening. And what I would like to underline here, because I think it is a very, very rich, like multiple work project that needs to be discussed in depth. But just something very general is that you accompany this process in Vieques from like the active experimentation of the military until, well, it becomes a natural reservation. Now we have to deal with the remainder, with all the residues of the experimentation. And each work marks that process. But then once you enter the territory of the post, then we start talking about the eco-catastrophe in other terms. And incidentally, but not accidentally, this happens to coincide with the increase of interest in your work for archaeology and for fossils and the emergence of like much deeper history. So I'm trying to read the completion of Vieques in 2010 perhaps, with like all the works you did over that decade. And I'm trying to read it as, well, and then you start seeing the emergence of other material that is deeper in that not only looks at what you find, but also what we will become in terms of fossils. And then we start getting into the territory of Puerto Rican Light, and that are like, yeah, proto-history.
Well, I'm sorry, I'll let you talk too, but
No,
before I forget my thought, I think it's really important what you're going to say. Well, I mean, think about this. Those questions come to mind it's very logical, because if you're looking, as we did, doing a case study on an island that has depleted uranium bullets and plutonium on it, which we know that will take literally a scale of time that's beyond our own ability to comprehend before it will no longer be contaminating or, toxic in that landscape. Well, then already you're thinking about scales of time that go beyond the human, right? It's going to be an inhuman amount of time before those contaminants ever leave that land now that they've been introduced to that piece of land. So this idea of like larger epochs of geological time themselves are marked in that landscape, or that's a condition that is revealed or manifested by the very act that has happened there, by this act of bombing that has taken place, and the way that, and it just becomes interesting if you think about like uranium, which is probably being extracted from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right, and then put into a bomb that's now being transplanted and now on a little parcel of land on an island in the Caribbean that will now stay there for millions of years, So this idea of what does that mean, I think, became an interest of ours in that project.
It's definitely a link, yeah. So also you could see, our interest in mark making and traces, and in this case, the wake, right? Like the boat is leaving a wake, and the wake is also a trace, right? Which is, really interesting in terms of its multiple meanings. It's just a trace that is left in the water, but it's about awakening, and it's also about, commemorating the death of someone who just have passed, right? So you have in the wake all of that. But I think something that you can, a structure, a methodology that you can use to link these two projects that span 20 years in between will be, I think, traces, right? Of course, in addition to attention to post-colonial eco-critical attunement, you could also say. So I think that, the trace will be a good way to link these two things. And also in Puerto Rican Light, I think the concept of depth also, it's somehow still in there. For example, one of the things that interests in the work of Tom Flavin in general was like his debt to the electrical system and very sunlight of fossil fuels that power his work. And specifically with Puerto Rican Light, how that title could not have been made possible without the migration of Puerto Ricans in the 1950s to New York through the economic development of Operation Bootstrap, right? That what it did is brought
Jennifer,
corporations.
maybe we can change the slide to Puerto Rican Light. Yeah, and then we're now in the territory of Puerto Rican Light.
We're in the right image. And the title of his work, Puerto Rican Light, could not have been possible or even imagined without the migration of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. as a result of what we mentioned a little bit before, Operation Bootstrap, and that promoted the migration of low-wage workers to the city, specifically New York and Chicago. And there was an interview that our historian named Jasmine Ramirez made to Jeannie Blake, to whom Flavin dedicated the work, in which she mentions that when Flavin brought the work to the gallery in 1965, was produced in 65, and plugged it in to the electrical grid of the city, she saw it and she mentioned the colors look Puerto Rican, or it looks Puerto Rican, and it was because of her attendance to the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York, which was a new phenomenon during that time, the result of like a massive migrations of Puerto Ricans to the city as a result of like, you know, an economic policy. So you have there something that may seem like a capricious thing to do, but how would not have happened without this larger network of convergences and interconnections, right? Which is, I think, the connecting thread of everything we have been talking so far.
Maybe we can give a little bit of context also. I mean, as we did with Vieques, we gave a very quick overview, an incomplete overview of what these works were and what Puerto Rican Light was. Since you started working on this material, and since it came to your knowledge that this work of Flavin had this hidden history, because that's something that it's written anywhere when you look at that work, at that light sculpture. You first showed it at the America Society, and you made the condition for the presentation of this work that it would be fed not from the regular electrical power, but from stored sunlight from Puerto Rico in New York City. And then 6 years later, we started the conversations at the Dia Foundation, where I was working, and not yet actually. You even started before with Philip Byrne. And as you move forward in the development of the project, then the cave appeared as a major character in this artwork. And then we started working for the installation of that Flavin piece inside a millenary cave in Puerto Rico, fed by sunlight, but not stored sunlight, but just like direct sunlight. And then we started thinking about a bunch of other connotations and ramifications of the work. I think another critical element that came up alongside the cave was para la naturaleza. And yeah, Jennifer, you have the power, so we're now hassling you for a change lights.
Not that many slides. Okay, everyone.
Sorry about that. But then we started working with another key protagonist, which I think was at the same level as the civil disobedience movement in Vieques, which was Para la Naturaleza in Puerto Rican Light, meaning this is a civil organization, a private venture, but with a very, very citizen-driven and island-driven vocation that wants to preserve a huge mass of land in Puerto Rico for diversity, for research, for citizen engagement and development. And they became partners, and they gave us the possibility to work in this cave. And I like to think about this evolution from the eco-catastrophe in present time to something that deals with a much deeper and longer scale of reading, from a civil disobedience movement to semi-institutionalized, very structured already, private initiative to structure the way the island is going to recover resources. And there is another commonality I like to point out. And the connection with hope, actually. I think the way you've engaged with them is you're suddenly, intervening, art is appearing and is providing a code for hope. No? So I think it is very interesting to read both projects this way. And I would like to ask you about after 2 years of Puerto Rican Light and all that has come from this work, what is your reading from the perspective of the hurricane and the way it closed? The project opens in September 2015, and it has 2 years of exhibition, and then when it's supposed to close in September 2017, pretty much on the date of the scheduled closure, the Hurricane Maria hits. And so the closure becomes a blackout. So a work that has to do with light, where we had been talking about Ralph Ellison, we had been talking about a lot of issues connected with electricity, then suddenly we are dealing with an ending that is a blackout. And how do you now take all that in? Before we talk about the video that came out of the same context.
I think that before we get into that, something that Puerto Rican Light, in a way, was a very extremely precise, extremely difficult thing to do, because it's almost to do something impossible, right? Which is how basically by reciting that work inside a cave in Cueva Vientos in Puerto Rico, and connecting it with solar panels so that it goes on outside the electrical grid of the island. Basically what was done was a dramatic transformation of the work, conceptually, experientially, and politically. And the detail or the challenge or difficulty was how to preserve this work.
The work by Dan Flavin.
The work by Dan Flavin. And at the same time, invent a new work altogether, and without making any material alteration to the work or changing anything to the work.
Not exploiting the work visually as an asset of your piece. What you see here is from the perspective of the light sculpture installed in the cave. You see the entrance of the cave many meters down, and I think it's important to point out that what was installed in the cave was no exhibition copy, was the work of Dan Flavin in the collection of the Art Foundation. And I have to say that I was very honored to co-curate that project with Yasmil Raymond. And you have that move, but also the fact that you're parasitizing another work, which you're recreating a relationship of dependence or exploitation. You are reenacting a certain relationship, correct?
Well, something that's interesting, I think, as Guillermo was trying to point out about it, is that, there's the work that we make exists in the same work of this other artist. So it's just this kind of really strange inhabitation of something. And whereas in the past there was the model of the ready-made where you take anything and turn it into art, well, in this case, we took an artwork that already existed and turned it into a new artwork, which belongs to us. And it's a very strange ontological shift that takes place by doing that, which I think is really unique. I don't know of many examples. I don't know if there's any other example of that, but that's what the work consists of, and it's strange alchemy that took place in this project.
I think the only way you could find an analogy is like haunting or spirit possession. It's like suddenly it's like, I don't know, like my sister is not the same, there's a spirit. Like since she went to Puerto Rico, something weird has happened to her.
And I think we should actually share an anecdote or two that might be fun to...
But I think this is a good segue to the question that you were getting at.
I don't know if you're thinking the same thing as me, but if you recall, when we were installing it, I think the real spirit of Dan Flavin might have been maybe not so pleased about our activities, because if you recall, during the installation, there was Tropical Storm Dan that almost prevented us from installing the work in the cave. So we had a bunch of days where we had torrential rains, and it was precisely the scheduled installation period, and we had the head of installations from Dia Art Foundation, Jim, who had worked with Dan Flavin personally for many years, who was there to do the inspection of the artwork and to oversee the transplantation of it to the cave. And that was the first time we had personally met him, and we were, of course, so nervous about, not only this proposition and what we were doing, but also then the weather was, we had this tropical storm Dan that was keeping.
But it's a
things from
constant thing, right? So in September 2015, when the work was inaugurated, this storm came, right? And we wanted to, the date is not something arbitrary, it's the equinox.
Yeah.
So it's, the moment in which both the day breaks in half in equal parts, right? With forces of rise and decline happening. Speaking of spirits and stuff like that, there's this.
It was an intentional opening.
It was completely intentional. So then September 20 of 2016, there was an entire blackout on the island prior to the hurricanes, Maria, right? And then September 21, 2017, then there was the hurricane. So there's a sense of a cosmological, meteorological, whatever,
everything was happening,
whatever going on.
And in the meantime, the debt crisis was unleashing like crazy. And I can only point out that Juan López Bauza's text in the catalog we produced, which is there for whoever wants to acquire it. And I think there are not so many left, so I think it's a really great opportunity. It's a great book. There's this text by a fiction writer in Puerto Rico that writes about the rebellion of objects and how objects sort of like resist to what you want them to do, and then they start, like the scissors fall, and then they cut your shoe, and the coffee ruins the table, and so on and so forth. And I think it was, not so much that we were doing something profane to Flavin's memory, because I think we all admire Dan Flavin. It was more about like we're changing the place of things in a way that alters the economy of forces around us, in our history and beyond, and we could all feel it. And it was really good to have Jim Schofelis, who was Flavin's assistant and who was director of operations at DIA for a long time, to have him with us, because he was also the accompanying link to this conversation with Flavin. And
I guess I should also point out one of the reasons why this project came about for DIA was because we were invited to make a project through the invitation of Philippe Verne, like you mentioned. And the initial invitation was to do something with DIA, and there was no particular, place in mind or whatnot. And immediately we became attracted to the incredible history of off-site projects that they had commissioned. And so, immediately we were drawn to that history more than, the space in Beacon or, other kind of locations. And ourselves, I think, our work is definitely interested in questions of land art, and in particular, the work of someone like Robert Smithson was very important to us in this whole process. And so for us, we wanted the opportunity to make a work with DIA that would be an extension of that tradition, which they hadn't done anything like that since the Joseph Beuys's A Thousand Oaks in the 1980s. Yeah. So it was kind of using that invitation to reinitiate a kind of aspect of the institution's history that hadn't been, activated in many years.
And you could have chosen any other site, because there are many amazing sites for you to make work. You did choose Puerto Rico in a very particular way, and it took a long time to find the right cave. We had a few candidate caves, but this one was really important. But I also would like to link it to returning a sound, the way that biker goes to the island. Well, that's a form of geography, and in Puerto Rican Light, Cueva Vientos, there is a voyage, from like the airport, whatever, San Juan or Ponce, and then the road, and then the walk. And so you're again dealing with like the topography, but also the symbolic topography, the geography, the psychogeography of the island, and you're forcing people to have an experience that is not the ordinary mapping of this particular territory. And you go through the petrochemical like ruins or like abandoned site. You actually do go through a very, very complex sequence of scenes, right? So, and then you made this video that again, this is Returning a Sound, which is the most celebratory piece out of the Vieques project.
May I add something here? Because I think this might be an interesting also point that you asked earlier that we didn't get to answer, to kind of give you an insight into our like methodology or how we work. So we had made this piece, Returning a Sound, in 2004, where we had taken this trumpet, which we were thinking about it like in the commemorative structure of a trumpet as this thing to both celebrate a victory and also as a kind of military instrument, of course, as well. And we made this kind of anthem that happened after the military had left. So it's called Returning a Sound. And the idea was to return a sound to a landscape that was already marked prior by the sound of ear-splitting detonations. And to return another sound to the landscape that would be both a celebration but also a call for continued vigilance after the military had gone. And then the point about that is that so when we were doing that piece and we start thinking about, okay, we're working with a trumpet, that's interesting. And then, well, what is the history? Why did trumpets get associated with warfare? And then we did this in a long period of time, like from 2006 to 2012. We did a whole body of work where we were looking at the relationship between militarism and music and how in fact, many instruments, including the trumpet, were first developed. The trumpet, for example, was used so that the generals would be able to make commands over the noise of the battlefield and send orders to the military soldiers. And that was one of the reasons why that instrument was developed. And then from there, looking at the military origins of music, then we got into the idea of like how music became a spoil of war and how there were certain kind of cultural convergences that took place when there were military engagement. So we made a piece about the Turkish march entering into Viennese culture and then ending up in Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And then from there, we looked at the origins of music. We started to think about, well, why do we have music at all? Why do humans have musical capacities? And what's the reason for that? And that's where we ended up in the cave. So we then started looking at the cave as the site where not only was it the place for visual arts, but it's also the place where today archaeologists find remnants of prehistoric human culture. And for like Documenta, we made this piece with the oldest musical instrument ever discovered to date, which was a bone flute carved from the wing bone of a griffin vulture that was found in the Holzfels cave in southern Germany, in Tübingen, outside of Tübingen, Germany. And we made this piece for Documenta in which we were looking at this bone flute and trying to think about, well, what kind of music did
early modern humans could have heard. So
yeah.
So what we were doing that is when we started thinking about, that's exactly when the DIA project was invited. So we were thinking about caves then because of music.
I remember that moment, and I think we were all fascinated by this avenue of research that you were developing. And what I like is that now I can read much more clearly that evolution and the way you make this connection of the very remote past and the current like geopolitical situation, global situation, the current politics, the way those connections occur, I see all of them much more clearly. If I can go back to what comes out of Puerto Rican Light as a video, which is the Now We Became People Again, is that there's a sound element in this piece that again brings us to this idea of like sound translating not necessarily emotions but like physical facts. So it's like in particularly here the hum. But what I like is that your work uses a lot of things as musical instruments that are not, or uses musical instruments in ways that are, like abhorrent, and then so I like these aberrations to be like a defining feature of what you do, and here by replicating the buzz of electricity in a fluorescent lamp with a singer's hum, you are like indicating or signaling the lamp as itself a producer of sound, like a note, like the fluorescent lamp, it becomes a musical instrument as well. Tell us more about Then I We Became People Again, which is a very recent work, 2017.
It's, the title is borrowed from a text by José Luis González, a Puerto Rican writer who wrote a story about a blackout in the Northeast in 1965, which was the same year that Flavin made Puerto Rican Light. So the story was about migrant workers who come to El Barrio, to their house, and discover there's no electricity. And then they have a moment of collective identification in which they realize, by looking at the stars and the moon without the bright lights of the city and the electrical grid, they discover some what they left behind by leaving the island. Of course, it may sound like something very romantic, but then at the end, the electricity comes back again, right? And it's like, and it continues. The same thing happens again, you know, exploitation, etc., right? So this text, we work with the composer to basically, this story that is about a blackout, make the voice become an electrical transformer to electrify the voice itself. So by choosing things like certain vocals or certain consonants to give an electrical arc to the text that is about a blackout, right?
And then also, this for us was, again, thinking about like historical precedents. So, you know, and specifically thinking about a way to close the project that we did with Dia in Cueva Vientos, which is where this is filmed. You know, we thought of the famous film of Robert Smithson, of his helicopter over the spiral jetty. And for us, this is our version of that. This is our kind of, not a documentation of that piece. It's a new work, but it's grounded in that other project. So, you know, when we had we were working with the Flavin sculpture, we asked Dia to make a sound study, and we learned that the sound that the bulbs make is a B flat. So this B flat is the sound that you hear. So there's this, you know, that work is sort of documented in this film through sound.
Yeah. Or through absence, right? So you don't see the work, but the presence of the work is through the sound that the bulbs make. And so the two sounds is the voice, and then the sounds of the electrical bulbs of from the sculpture.
And then here, for example, you see what you mentioned earlier, which is this corridor that you have to drive past in order to get to the cave, which was this petrochemical corridor that was built in the started in the 1950s, and it closed in the 1970s. And in its heyday, it was the largest petrochemical refinery in the Western Hemisphere. And it was only as a result of the Arab oil crisis that it then, just like the pharmaceutical plant, collapsed overnight and has been left as a brownfield site for the last 40 years.
Yeah, very much like Spiral Jetty that has this other jetty next to it, which is an old oil pump that is completely derelict and also coexists with the site. And I remember noticing it and us discussing the commonalities of these two sites. I like what you said, Jennifer, about like this is not documentation, but I like it because it's not documentation, but it ends up being the only remaining document, the only remaining thing coming out of it, and therefore it stands as document. And I think also a really interesting particularity of your work is that, well, it's not that it follows the protocol of making documents or public records and so on and so forth. It does not follow any type of protocol for that purpose, but it ends up being the only reference document, and therefore, you know, like the Vieques movement will need to be read through your work necessarily, even by those who are not interested in contemporary art. So I like the fact that also Puerto Rican Light becomes a context where you generate documentation, documents, or you monumentalize in a certain way things that otherwise would completely happen unnoticed and go unnoticed for many years, and maybe would never be witnessed otherwise. And I like that aspect of your work. It doesn't have the vocation of the document, but it ends up documenting things that otherwise would be completely lost.
Well, I think like all of what we try to do anyway, there always has to be a level of experimentation is like really important, you know? So we wouldn't approach the document in the conventional way. It would be like how to think about a new way, how to give a new language a new form to what that can be, and how that can become the question of the document can become the very place of experimentation. And so that's what this is, and I think that's in all of our work, something that's a value that we have, that we try to always put forward when we make things, is how can I take these things that are given and find new ways to create new vocabulary, new way to do it. And that's in this as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's 11, so let's try to open this up, unless I think this is the right time. So would anybody have any comment or question or suggestion for Jennifer and Guillermo? Would there be any? I see one here, on the first row on the right. This side here.
Hello? Thank you for your presence and your work. I'll be short and try to be precise. For my colleagues and me, this is a very significant contribution to our history of art. We've been part of the struggles for years and close witness of things that have been happening. So we can understand the history of our economy, the political history, the military history. We have been struggling in all these areas. We also have been struggling in our art, trying to bring out the best of our artists. And we considered, or I considered myself, this is a contribution to our history of our art. There's no other way, you know, and I feel honored in that it's by one of our great, or two of our greats. You know, that's, I have to say that because we come from the struggle, really close. Okay. Así que thank you, Jennifer, Guillermo, and I didn't get your name?
Manuel.
Manuel. Thank you for this.
Thank you. I had the same feeling. I think when we were
Thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you.
It's very true. I had the same feeling when we were working in the island, and I'm a Spaniard myself, so you know, like I'm part of that collective karma of colonial history, and you know, like I could have been treated badly, and I was actually treated very, very well, and no one let me pay for lunch and things like that. Guillermo is very stubborn in that aspect, but I felt that across the island, whenever we were going, Ponce, Guayanilla, San Juan, and like in many places, and you know, like people in haciendas, natural reservations, they were all very, very honored that this was actually happening through art. It's not that it was some sort of civil movement or, you know, like some, you know, the fact that it was happening through art gave this a special relevance, because people felt that they were contributing to something that was creating also hope. And I think that was one of the great achievements of the project. It involved a great level of criticism, a great level of irony, a great level of absurdity, because, you know, like we're finally bringing a light sculpture into a cave for mostly bats and spiders and cockroaches to look at it, you know. So we had to study how bats and spiders and cockroaches would react and their lives be changed by 2-year exposure to this type of exhibition. Actually, it happened to be okay, so we could go for it. But it was mostly, you know, the impact it would have on all the people involved. And again, you know, it was also a micro-revolution in the island. It was beautiful. And so thank you so much for your appreciation.
Thank you.
Any other words, questions, remarks, comments?
I just thought it was really interesting when you show throughout your work kind of like the duality of meaning in an object, like kind of like acknowledging something as like an agent of something good and then also something kind of like really terrible and sort of kind of contradicting the other purpose of the object. So like with the bell being an agent of destruction but also being this agent of like harmony and sound and music. So I just thought it was great to see that.
I mean, I think because we're two people from totally different backgrounds, totally different personalities, we love paradox because that's what we live all the time. I mean, our relationship is just, that's built on that, this kind of irreconcilabilities, but having to manage them all the time. And I think that's a real condition of our particular collaboration that gets manifest in our work all the time. I mean, we're actually been pretty calm today, but usually when we're talking, we're almost always fighting with each other and saying the opposite is true. So that's part of our work.
Guillermo, do you agree?
Absolutely not.
All right, any more comments, questions?
Hi, thank you. Your work has a philosophical and even like as many historical layers to it, but it's presented as art. How do you see those kind of intersections between more kind of academic theory that you're engaging with some of the ecological stuff, and just the directness of kind of what you're doing when you actually go to these sites and you use the people and the landscapes there to present? How do you juggle all those different kind of elements into your final art?
Something that we've been thinking about how convergences or intersections could be. It's something that is constant throughout all the works that we have made, right? You have the convergence of multiple diverse things or the intersection of many different things, and yeah.
I like the way you work with your research, which I've seen in different projects, which, you know, you are reading, you're passing books to one another, or you come and oh, I discovered this, and so on and so forth. And then you go into the works of an author, you know, like it can be like pretty, you know, like straightforward, philosophical or academic and scholarly. And then you get to an idea that helps you make the work, and then you want to involve the author. And you've managed to involve a lot of important authors in your practice. I mean, like, not only authors, but I mean, also like artists like Calle 13, who is, at that time, was more like a street poet, rapper, the reggaeton artist, and today is a global, you know, Grammy-awarded musician. But, you know, with Tim Morton, with Ted Chiang, there's a number of authors who have been informing your work and then who have become part of your work. And I think that's really interesting, how the fact that you're a collective helps you, you know, become more of a collective with the work, and then you can involve these voices, right?
Right.
Sorry, I responded.
No, I'm
forget.
going to try to answer that better. I think that, you know, there's like an infinite number of decisions that need to be made whenever you're trying to manifest something into physical form. And so for us, the process of going through a very rigorous research and reading and investigating and going from things that go from, you know, general investigation, like doing, like, you know, literally going and doing case studies, site visits, getting material, primary evidence about stuff, to reading then about, you know, historical writing about subject matters, or going into then deeper or more abstract types of thinking, like philosophy, which is a big thing that we do read a lot of, and critical theory and all of that. It feels to me, at least, that all of those things need to be done. You need to know all of that in order to then just say, I want to put that glass on the table, because that decision was made as a result of taking all those other things into account. So it seems it's very precise. There's never anything just whimsical. It's always, and I think that again has to do with our collaboration. Like, we have to somehow find a reason for both of us to decide to put that glass of water on the table. And for us, it's all of those steps along the way that allow us to make those kinds of decisions. Even if it means that for the majority of the people who come to see that glass on the table, they may not know all of those factors that made us arrive at those millions of micro decisions to get there. However, I think that it's in that glass of water on the table, and for the one who wants to go in reverse, you can tease all of those meanings out because it went into building that decision. So that's, I feel, how we work.
And if I may add to what you're saying, Jennifer, I think there's a great deal of study of processes of translation and conversion and transference in your work. And the way philosophy appears as a very simple event, as you know, like maybe a beam of light moving through a cave, that is a philosophical event. You try to build on the depth of that, but you also try to look at that as a bare fact. And I think it's very important that we see your works as attempts to find the perfect balance between what is seen and what is not seen, and what is said and what is not said, and also, as Guillermo was saying before, a balance between the trace and all that cannot leave a trace. Like, I think in your work and works like Apotome or some of the archaeomusicological works, you get to see, because you're focusing on sound, which is, you know, ephemeral to a great extent. I mean, I only have become documented very recently. We can see how much of archaeology is about all the things that we cannot keep a record of, or that we cannot find a trace of, right?
And that notion, too, is, I think, something that we're really attracted to. Like, even the work that we did with sound, we were interested in precisely those things that fall outside of the, you know, either the harmonic, like apotome itself. That word is such an interesting word. It's a Greek word that means a specific interval in the like a semitone that doesn't, it's not like, it's not a whole number. It's an irreducible remainder. So it's a sound that goes beyond, actually, even the acoustic. You can't even hear it. So it's a sound that is produced, it goes beyond what is the limits of the perceptible. So we're interested in these things too, that sometimes fall, like even the film of, you know, the way that we use language in that film, like what are the things that fall outside of the logos, like beyond words, what are those other capacities that also signify, that go beyond particular meaning. So we took that text, for example, the short story, and we treated it through a filter of thinking about what other kinds of sonorities, what kind of presence, what kind of grain does the voice have itself that can tell us something about that story that falls outside of conveying the narrative of that story. So we're always looking for those kind of obscure or far away or paradoxical places to be those sites from which we're focusing. It's never usually the obvious, it's always this place somewhere else that we're looking. The dark, the obscure, I guess.
Maybe a last question, comment, remark. Mm-hmm.
I just want to thank you so much, because it's so interesting to hear the history and the richness, the depth through which you research these projects. So thank you for that. And I'm curious, what's next?
Well, we're opening a show in March in Bilbao, but there is no new work, but I think it is very important to also work with artists you've worked on, on new work, work on readings of the work. And none of these works we're presenting is a new work, so it's not even recent work. So it was a whole process of okay, is this material now, or is this the past? And actually it's very much now, because precisely we're dealing with the Caribbean, with Puerto Rico, and we're doing with contemporary history in the making. Every time you present this work, it is an event that has a confrontation with current facts. And one of the reasons to present this work and not say okay, I will propose the exhibition of the last of your works. Why, works from 2014, 2006, 07? because I think there is an amazing pertinence to this material. So like I actually had that question as a potential question to end this talk, and like, let's talk about something that you're preparing for the future or something like that. And it was like, no, let's just try to talk about the way we can confront the current events, right? So, I mean, I appreciate your question because I also was like in your place, and I was like, why don't we? And then there's like, no. So, like I have to convey that, but maybe you can talk about what's coming next.
No. I mean, maybe something like the concept of the trace, maybe something that can link all, this with the question about philosophy. I'm talking about something else right now. Well, talk about the demon then. Anyway, let me finish. I wanted to say something. The trace, basically, it's interesting because, I mean, we can go as far as to say that the trace is our medium. It's not sculpture, it's not performance, sound. We could say maybe that the trace is our medium because the trace for us is a poetic trope. And in there you can go into philosophy, you can go into, things like that, but also it's a set of material operations, right? Like mark making, tracing, and the survival of traces. And that link things that are paradoxical, like, presence and absence, erasure and inscription, but also the trace is a form of memory. Right? So in that sense, maybe it's a way of connecting, or making convergences between works that we have done in the past, and something that we may, thinking of, which, Jennifer, you wanted to say something about that.
Well, I mean, if I can translate your very open-ended answer, I think you are not planning on any breakthrough from all this field that we're configuring and that we've been mapping in the conversation. I think your research actually has amassed a lot of material that will keep manifesting in the coming years from this critical mass. And I think it's nice to see how you're confident about like not revealing what's coming next because you don't need to. You think this critical mass is actually still operating and still active. Maybe it's a way of synthesizing these two last remarks. Jennifer, you want to add anything?
I just wanted to share in a concept that we have become interested in developing out of this work that had to do, like you described so clearly, about the conditions of the cave, the light and darkness, all these sort of paradoxical day and night conditions, led us, as our research always does, to another interesting phenomenon, which is the paradox of midday. The moment which is probably close to the hour that it is right now, when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, when the day is divided into equal parts of rise and decline. And there's a beautiful text by Roger Caillois from the French writer, College of Sociology, that he wrote for Minotaur, the Surrealist journal, that's called the Noon Complex. And we're really interested in this concept right now. And I think it makes perfect sense to go to noon after leaving the cave, because noon is this moment when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. And what he describes about it is that it's the moment when specters or demons appear. And historically, it's the moment of it they call the demonium meridianum, which is this demon, this specter that haunts or visits you at noon and pulls you out of your concentration. And it gets manifested, interestingly enough, in a state of like listlessness or torpor, like, this feeling in the middle of the day where you just don't know what to do and you're just like stuck. So it's a kind of really fascinating phenomenon that I think also talks about, again, the present. It has to do with the word in biblical times was actually one of the 7 deadly sins, and it was called acedia, was the word for it. And it had to do with this condition of being
living in not being able to live in the present and seeing the future as something unbearable.
Which sounds like a good definition of
it sounds like
our times.
anachronism in real time or something like that.
So that's what we're thinking about right now.
Hey, there you go. Hey, we got something from that.
And the point is that the midday is the point of day where the sun, your body casts no shadows. So So that's also quite beautiful, right? So it's the sun is hitting you, but it's at that moment in the day where the body doesn't cast a shadow because the sun is directly coming from
And the
above.
body then is exposed to all kinds of things. Right.
Wow, what an end. Well, thank you so much. This was great. Thank you, Guillermo, Jennifer.